So could I begin by thanking the organisers for the opportunity to come and talk at the conference today. You might ask, I suppose as a first question, what's the role of the social sciences in risk assessment for climate change? And of course, we've known for a number of years that the whole question of dangerous climate change has a range of human and social issues attached to it, not least because if having done a risk assessment, you want to communicate it to people, you need to know the frame of reference of the audience and the stakeholders that you're actually trying to get the communication across to. So I think that's one of the main roles of social scientists in this arena. Perceptions of climate change have been studied both in the UK and internationally for a number of years now. And what do we know? Well, the good news is that climate skepticism in Europe, at least, is very low. So when asked, and this is from the European Perceptions of Climate Change survey that we led from Cardiff a few years ago, most people think the world's climate is changing, and most people attribute it, at least in part or mainly, to human activity. The current study focuses not so much on what is happening about climate change as on adaptation options, and it was commissioned and started in March 2019 as part of the UK Climate Resilience Programme. And there are two reports here, which you can see on the right-hand side, which are available on the Climate Resilience Programme website, a top-line findings report from the survey and a briefing for communications given the findings of the survey. The research gap, there hasn't been a lot on changing climate adaptation beliefs over the years, and we're responding to this. And so in the following results, when you see the Resilrisk study of 2019 compared to 2016 and 2013, what we're referring to is our own European Perceptions of Climate Change UK sample in 2016 and the important Ricardo A. Leeds University study of 2013, which is obviously has become a little dated now, which is why we wanted to do the new work. Survey design, fairly straightforward panel survey. What you have to bear in mind in interpreting results is the date of the fieldwork, which was 14th to 22nd of October 2019. And prior to that, we'd had a year of climate protests in the UK and elsewhere, lots of media reports, but also many reports of extreme weather impacts around the globe. And in fact, the survey went out just before the general election in the UK. So Brexit was a very salient political issue here at that time. This was the first question on the survey. It's open-ended, the most important issue facing the UK. And really quite surprisingly, climate change came as a very close second to Brexit at that point in time. And if you compare that with EPCC in 2016, only 2% unprompted said that. So there's been a huge rise in that period of the salience of the importance of climate change for the British public. We asked a new item on climate urgency, and you can see there people gave very high levels of urgency to dealing with the issue. On beliefs, something we've studied at Cardiff for a number of years is something called psychological distance. So maybe you think climate change is happening, but it won't affect people like me, it won't happen here. And if it happens, it's not really that serious in terms of its impacts, or it won't happen in my lifetime. And these are all aspects of psychological distance. And this is a question we've been asking in relation to temporal distance over the last 10 years now. And you'll see there's been a gradual increase in the number of people, percentage of people who report that they think we are already feeling the effects of climate change. However, in terms of geographic and social distance, you'll see there, again, this is from the 2019 survey, that people still believe that the serious impacts won't fall on themselves personally or their family. Slightly more think it will fall on the UK as a whole, but predominantly people think climate change will affect other people, potentially as well in developing countries elsewhere around the globe. So there's a temporal and geographical, there's a geographical distance to climate change. We asked a number of questions about climate change impacts. Here we see a range of impacts that were actually asked on the right-hand side in the PREPARE study in 2013 and in our own replication of their items, we found flooding risk, not surprising, was the highest risk, and there'd been no change. A number of the others have gone up, but what's really notable is that anything to do with heat risk had increased substantially over that period since 2013. And that was true for a number of items on the survey to do with heat risk. There's been a large rise in the salience of heat risk in the mental model of climate change for the British public. Support for climate action and policy, pretty high support for all the adaptation policies we put to people. So that's very encouraging from a public policy perspective. And to summarize the key findings from the resource study, climate change is the second most mentioned issue facing the UK in the near future. High levels of worry and urgency. Most people we see, I believe we see the impacts now, but don't feel personally at risk. Quite a lot of emotion attached to climate change now. Risk perception and protection, flooding remains the top risk. Other climate change risks, especially heat, have increased, and that gives a communication and engagement window around heat impacts that wasn't there before. And then action and policy, majority support for adaptation policies. And then down the bottom, the main responsibility to act on mitigation and adaptation is seen to lie with the UK government, but actually the government itself is not trusted to communicate effectively about the issue. So there's somewhat of a dilemma there for government. Given what has happened with the COVID pandemic in the UK, we felt it was important to check these findings with a replication, a relatively straightforward replication of some of the key items on the survey during August of this year. And despite the obvious salience of the pandemic in importance, broadly similar findings were found on worry, distance, perception of impacts, etc. So what that means is that the public mental model of climate change in the UK is a relatively stable one. And even this major shock in terms of the pandemic risk has not moved that set of perceptions away from where they were about a year ago. And that's a very important finding. We have a number of recommendations, which I won't read out here, for communicators, for engaging the public. I think I'll just point out the fact that we have evidence that climate change is definitely getting closer to home, but we have to work harder on that. As I've mentioned already, the surging concern for extreme heat is a communication opportunity that was not there in 2013. And there are a number of issues around health risk, well-being and adaptation that would be very fruitful avenues to both research and think through in terms of their communication implications. Now, since this is a research conference, I will mention a couple of issues on the final two slides. So, we're thinking about 3 degrees at this conference. So how would we communicate the severity of rising risk around climate change? This has not really been addressed in the research literature in the past. So if we think about the potential negative consequences of 3 degrees, there's been a debate in the literature for a number of years about potential reactants to fear appeals. The point being that if you scare people about an issue but don't give them a sensible way to avoid the risk, then they may well switch off to the message. So that's one of the potential traps in trying to communicate 3 degree scenarios to people. And of course, the effective impacts and response, as we found in researching them for our own research here, the survey here, are actually fairly uncertain and debated amongst experts. So it's difficult to pin down what 3 degrees really would mean by a certain time frame across the UK, because there's an uncertainty bounds attached to all the figures. One of the potential positive consequences, though, is that the message might be seen as more truthful and credible, and that this information may be novel for people, and so they will actually attend to it, given this is something new they're being told about the problem of climate change. There is a genuine dilemma about design, I think, though. How do we make 2, 3 and 4 degrees real for ordinary people, bring it home to them in a concrete fashion? There are various ways you can do it. We've done research at Cardiff quite early on framing around map-based communication and photographs to try to get across this. I think was the implication, the yellow is the implication of a 10-metre sea level rise for the city of Cardiff. In the resource study, that we recently completed, we tried to present people with different scenarios of warming, both 2 degrees and 4 degrees, both globally and for the UK. And I think that our conclusion from that was it was actually quite difficult to make 4 degrees look distinctive from 2 degrees simply on these numbers. You know, people think 2.6 million and 3.3 million are a lot, whereas we know as climate scientists that there's a very big difference between those two degrees of warming. So I think there's a real challenge for the research community to try to understand how higher levels of warming can be communicated to ordinary people. So on that provocative note, I'll end. I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd like to thank the research team who are all involved in designing and conducting the resource study. You can find the 2 reports on the Climate Resilience Organisation, our own project, the Resource Project webpage. I'd like to thank the funders, the Natural Environment Research Council and the UK Met Office. Thank you.